welcome to another program from Assisi in this series on Franciscana. My name is Solanus Mary. This year, 2026, marks the 800th anniversary of the death of St. Francis. There will be much happening in Assisi in the months leading up to the 4th of October, his feast day. In today's program, let's talk a little about St. Francis's death and burial. In the last few years of his life, certainly in the time after he was imprinted with the stigmata, Francis hung body and soul upon the cross with Christ, as St. Bonaventure tells us. He could no longer walk because of the nails protruding from the stigmata in his feet, and thus had to be carried about. He began to be afflicted with a variety of illnesses. Bonaventure tells us that his suffering was so great that there was not a single part of him which did not have its share of agony. We are told that Francis knew the date of his death beforehand. 2 years after the stigmata, that is in the year 1226, he asked the friars to bring him to St. Mary of the Angels, the Porziuncula, a place always very dear to his heart. There he lay, stretched out in the form of a cross. He gave a final exhortation to the friars present. He had a passage of St. John's Gospel read to him. Then he died quietly, praying and singing a psalm, as St. Bonaventure tells us. Then Bonaventure goes on to tell us of something very interesting that happened at the time of Francis's death. When it was already dusk, a great flock of larks gathered over the building. Although they normally prefer the light of day and avoid the shades of night, there they remained, flying about and singing with unusual joy, clearly testifying by the sweetness of their song to the glory of the saint who had so often called upon them to praise God. It was the 3rd of October, 1226. After his death, the marks of the stigmata remained visible on his body for all to witness and venerate. Many miracles occurred shortly after Francis's death, and several visions of his body being taken up in glory are recorded. One of them is celebrated in a fresco by Giotto in the upper basilica here in Assisi. One of the friars, Brother Augustine, a holy man in his own right, was close to death at the time. Bonaventure tells us that this friar had been unable to speak for a long time, but now those who were with him suddenly heard him cry out, "Wait for me, Father, wait, I am coming with you." The friars were amazed and asked him to whom he was speaking. He told them he could see St. Francis going to heaven, and the moment he said it, he died peacefully. The morning after he died, Francis's remains were brought home to the city of Assisi. En route to the city, the cortege stopped in San Damiano so that Clare and the poor ladies could venerate the remains of their Holy Father, another scene depicted by Giotto in one of his frescoes in the upper basilica. Then the remains were taken to and buried in the Church of St. George. By the way, this church now lies within the Basilica of St. Clare. Francis was canonized in 1228, thus becoming St. Francis. The ceremony was carried out in Assisi by Pope Gregory IX. This ceremony is captured in another fresco by Giotto in the upper basilica. Almost at once, the construction of a new church began, which would house his remains, the present lower basilica. 2 years after his canonization, in 1230, Francis's remains were translated from St. George's Church to this new basilica. The remains were immediately buried under the earth of the basilica, beneath the high altar, probably to prevent them being seized by a rival city, an event not uncommon in those days. There they remained for 6 centuries. In the early 19th century, the continent of Europe was devastated by the Napoleonic Wars. After the defeat of Napoleon, there took place a meeting of the European powers in the Congress of Vienna. The intention was to bring about a lasting peace in Europe. Just a few years later, in 1818, the Holy Father, Pope Pius VII, gave permission to the friars to excavate under the earth of the basilica to recover the remains of St. Francis. It is interesting to note that this pope was the pope who had been abducted by Napoleon and held hostage for a time. I wonder why it was that the pope gave permission to exhume the remains of St. Francis. Was it because there was a great demand for peace in Europe in the wake of the Congress of Vienna a few short years before? What better remedy for a war-torn Europe than to exhume for veneration the remains of the great peacemaker from the Middle Ages? In any case, all that was found were skeletal remains that were later examined closely by experts. In 1820, the Pope declared the identity of the body of St. Francis found under the high altar of the lower church of Assisi to be certain. A crypt was built beneath the earth of the basilica to house Francis's remains. This work was finished in 1824. The crypt was dug from solid rock and built in the neoclassical style. Around 1928, the whole basilica complex was returned to the church by the Italian state, who had held possession of it for many years. The present-day crypt dates from 1932, when architectural changes transformed the crypt into a neo-Romanesque structure. There, until the present day, above the crypt's altar, rest the remains of St. Francis. In 1932, were transferred from the lower basilica to the crypt the remains of 4 friars: Angelo, Rufino, Matteo, and Leo, his trusted secretary and confessor. These 4 friars were amongst the early followers of St. Francis. Their tombs are located around the crypt's altar. On the stairway down to the crypt can be found the tomb of Lady Jacoba, a noble Roman woman and a devoted follower of St. Francis, and a benefactress of the order. Thus, the crypt houses the remains of 6 holy persons, including St. Francis. In 1978, by authority of the Pope, Paul VI, the remains of St. Francis were re-examined. The new tests confirmed the results of the previous expert studies. I hope you have enjoyed this little piece on St. Francis. Obviously, we'll have more to say about St. Francis himself as the year progresses. So until the next time, this is Friars Solanus saying thank you for listening and God bless.